what's your assessment of the uptick that we've had in the mental problems since 2009? That's kind of where it started. What do you think what are the contributing factors to that?
Honestly, I would start with saying that we're not doing the preventive work. We have got to start in our elementary schools. Those elementary counselors are so bogged down with other things, but we have got to get in the classrooms, and we've got to teach them the social emotional skills that they need to make good decisions and to make good choices.
Not quite my question.
Okay.
What caused the uptick in mental problems starting to grow? In 2009, we started to see a growth of it. I'm not talking about what do we need to do about it now,
Yeah,
but we have not always had this problem to the extent we have it now. And it is, as you said, it's becoming epidemic.
And I think
so what is it that is the driver that is causing?
What we're seeing in the schools is that a lot of students have the same problems that we had, in the past, but they're not dealing with it in the correct manners. They don't have the same skills we've had in the past to deal with it.
But we've gone through years and years without going into social emotional learning. We've had years of cognitive teaching where schools were to educate the children, to teach them knowledge-based education. And so we didn't have this social emotional bent that we have today. So
and that is our problem.
What is the change?
And I think that is it. I think that we taught a lot of that in the homes in the past. We taught a lot of that on our social media outlets like TV, things such as that. We don't have that nowadays. Our kids are totally bombarded with just thinking about themselves and not being the kindness aspect to others. They see violence on a daily basis in their video games and then on TV. I think that is the difference. We had a nicer and kinder, as they say, society in the past. We don't have that anymore. And we don't have people that are actually teaching these kids, how to handle the everyday problems. And so a lot of the same things that we handled when we were growing up in the past, these kids don't have the same skills to handle that same problem. So what we hear a lot of is instead, I want to cut myself, or I want to kill myself, I want to hurt myself in some way.
So you're saying that the school now is really assuming the role of the parent?
In a lot of ways, in a lot of situations, yes.
Tell me, when you do a social emotional assessment and it indicates that there's some additional treatment, help needed, and the parents don't agree, what happens?
Well, what our hope is that we will, as counselors, develop a relationship with those parents that we can gain their trust, and we can show them, how those problems are affecting their students' learning. Every parent wants their child to be successful. And so we're hoping, by going that way, as counselors, that we'll be instrumental.
No, I understand that. But I'm just saying, you do the assessment, and you say, and the parents say, no, I don't agree. What does the school do?
Well, I think that we can still help that student in the sense that we're going to go into the classrooms and still do classroom lessons. There's tiers here, so we can still do the teaching part of it, and that student can still benefit from learning those skills by having a counselor on board, that is actually doing the preventive work, that's actually doing the teaching. Maybe not the individual. Usually when it's that sort of thing, the parents, are not in agreement with the individual counseling.
Okay, does the school go around the parents and maybe call in CPS or get somebody else?
If the student is in danger, of hurting himself or herself, or if we find that this is a severe mental problem, yes, then we go to what we do as counselors is we meet with the assistant principal, our principal, and we do come up with a plan, and then we do call the parent in, and then we will get assistance, of course, from our LSSPs, or maybe even, if we have a social worker on board, we will elicit their help to talk with the parent. Most of the cases I find that when we're talking about, how we can help a student and we're talking about a student's problems, most parents, are pretty on board with that. They're pretty concerned about it. Now, if the student is in danger, right, and the parent, does not respond, yes, we are going to call Children's Protective Services.
In the case we had, a little girl was taken out of her home because her parents had a difference of opinion with the school people. And unfortunately, she was in a state hospital for months. She was restrained. She was injected with drugs. And it took an attorney, a reporter, us, a psychologist, and her doctor to get her home. And that's what we want to avoid as we move forward with these bills. Yeah.
Because glad to hear you say that.
Yes.
It was very clear from earlier testimony that they're actually doing screening, evaluation, making determinations, and going around the parents without permission. And that's not supposed to be, but it's real clear. I mean, when you talk about evidence-based assessments, what's the evidence?
Correct.
It has to come from assessments and screening. And that's going on today in our schools without parental permission.
That's our concern too,
Yes.
and the
It's
push
a
for
very
universal
valid
mental
concern.
Yes, and the push for universal mental health screening has been even worse because there's been talk of actually doing that in the school clinic and making the screening instrument part of the intake process. We see it when we go to the doctor. I guess if you're over 50, you end up, you at least have a couple of mental health questions on your intake paperwork, or if you go into a hospital. But nobody talks to you beforehand and says, okay, so if we think that you are suicidal, your care is going to take a completely different trajectory, right? Nobody warns you first. And we worry about that being put onto potential violence and things like that. The best indicator of whether somebody is violent, in my opinion, is the same kind of training that the police get, where you're looking at an immediate risk. Once you get beyond that, you're into situations where you're having to predict the future, and none of us has a crystal ball. That's pretty much the way I see it.
In the issue of mental illness, it's not an exact science. It's and sometimes it's possible that we're confusing confusion in a child with mental illness. The kind of confusion that would come when they don't have good confidence in themselves. That's I think no one will disagree, one of the most important things for a child to have to feel stable is self-confidence. And when we had knowledge-based learning, where a student could learn something, pass a test, actually achieve something, they developed confidence in what they were learning, where they were going. But when we move over to the bent towards social emotional performance, and there's no right, it's all squishy out there. They have nothing to grab onto, nothing to hold on to. And so we're introducing more confusion into the little mind that's already confused from a dysfunctional, slightly functional home life and other life out there. And you couple that with the isolated life that they get by having this to communicate with. This is what they talk to. This is what they get their advice from. Between those three, we've got something that's feeding on itself here. And I feel that we've got a system that exasperates a problem rather than trying to work towards fixing it. And we end up with a confusion there of an issue where we have a confused mind as opposed to a mentally ill mind.
Yes, sir, we share your concern.